The morning my son-in-law's mother smiled at me across the breakfast table, I should have known something was wrong. Patricia Whitmore didn't smile unless she wanted something, or unless she'd already taken it. My daughter, Claire, had been married to their son, Brendan, for 3 years. 3 years of watching a kind, laughing woman slowly go quiet. Claire used to call me every Sunday morning without fail, chattering about her garden, her students she taught 3rd grade, her weekend plans. After the wedding, the calls got shorter. Then they moved to Whitmore Property, a private estate outside of Asheville, North Carolina, where the Whitmore family had built their little kingdom over 4 generations of timber money. After that, the calls almost stopped entirely. I told myself it was normal. Newlyweds finding their rhythm. I told myself a lot of things. My name is not important. Most people just call me Dad. I'm 63 years old, retired from 31 years as a high school history teacher, and I live alone in a small house in Knoxville, Tennessee, where I raised Claire after her mother passed. I am not a powerful man. I don't own a company. I don't have connections in Washington. What I have is one daughter and a younger brother named Walt, who spent 22 years as an investigative journalist for a major regional newspaper before going independent. Walt is the kind of man who, when he decides to look into something, does not stop until there is nothing left to find. I didn't fully understand what that meant until the spring Claire turned 31. It was a Wednesday in April when she finally called me, and I could tell immediately something was different. Her voice was steady in the way voices get when a person has been practicing what they're going to say. She told me Brendan's family had invited her on a weekend trip to their lake house in the mountains. She said it in a tone that made it sound less like an invitation and more like a summons. She asked if I wanted to come along. I said yes before she finished the sentence. When I arrived at the estate that Friday evening, the temperature was already dropping faster than the forecast had promised. A cold front was moving through the Smokies, and the sky had that flat gray look that old-timers around here call snow sky. Patricia met me at the door with that smile. Brendan was cordial in the way that men are cordial when they've been coached to be. His father, Gerald Whitmore, barely looked up from his leather chair. The lake house was a 40-minute drive up into the mountains, a winding 2-lane road that climbed into the kind of altitude where April still felt like February after dark. We took 2 vehicles. Brendan drove Claire in his truck. Gerald and Patricia followed in their SUV. I drove behind them in my own car, and I remember noticing, somewhere around the 3rd switchback, that Claire's head was turned toward her window and she wasn't moving. We arrived around 8 in the evening. The lake house was more of a compound, 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a private dock on a small mountain lake that had gone dark and still. The cold was serious up there. My breath made clouds. I pulled my jacket tighter and went inside. Dinner was quiet. Gerald talked about timber contracts. Patricia talked about a charity gala she was organizing. Claire ate maybe 6 bites and pushed her food around the rest of the time. Brendan topped off his wine glass twice and watched his mother with an expression I can only describe as waiting. I excused myself early, told them the drive had tired me out, and went to the room they'd given me at the end of the hall. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house. At 11:15 I heard voices. Not angry, careful. The kind of careful that means the conversation has been rehearsed. I cracked my door open. Patricia's voice, clear and smooth. It's just a short walk to the dock. The fresh air will do her good. Claire's voice, very quiet. It's freezing out there. Brendan. Come on, sweetheart. Don't make a thing of it. I stepped into the hallway. Claire was already in her coat, but just barely. No hat. No gloves. Patricia was guiding her toward the back door with a hand on her shoulder blade, and Brendan had opened the door to the cold. The temperature outside at that hour, according to my phone, was 26 degrees. The wind off the lake made it feel colder. I said clearly, Claire is not going outside. The room went very still. Gerald looked up from his chair with an expression I'd never seen directed at me before, the look of a man who is surprised that something he considers inconsequential has spoken. Patricia's smile didn't waver, which was somehow worse. Brendan closed his eyes briefly, the way people do when something has gone off script. Dad, Claire said, and the way she said it, I understood that she had been afraid to say anything herself. What happened in the next 4 minutes is difficult to write even now. Gerald stood up and told me, in a voice designed for talking to employees, that this was a private family matter, and I was a guest in their home. Patricia said something about how Claire had been struggling emotionally and that fresh air was part of what her therapist had recommended, a claim I knew was fabricated because Claire's therapist was a woman in Knoxville named Dr. Sandra Hughes, and I had spoken to her once, with Claire's permission, and Sandra had said nothing of the kind. Brendan put his hand on Claire's arm not gently and said, "Let's go." I stepped between them and my daughter. Gerald Whitmore was a large man, and he moved fast for 68. He put himself between me and the door in a way that was designed to look casual and wasn't. Brendan took Claire through the back door. I heard her say, "Brendan, please," and then the door closed. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I know some people will ask why I didn't act faster, and they deserve a truthful answer. Gerald stood between me and that door for the better part of 90 seconds while Patricia talked in a low, measured voice about how I was overreacting and how this was just a walk and how I needed to trust that they knew what was best for their family. I was 63 years old and alone in a house in the mountains with 3 people who were used to getting what they wanted. And for 90 seconds, I am ashamed to say this, I hesitated. Then Patricia said, "Claire has always been a little dramatic, hasn't she? She gets that from her mother's side. Claire's mother died of ovarian cancer when Claire was 9 years old. She was not dramatic. She was the bravest person I have ever known." I went through Gerald Whitmore like he was a suggestion. I got to the back door and I pulled it open, and the cold hit me like a wall. The porch light barely reached the dock. I could see 2 figures, Brendan, standing, and Claire, smaller, hunched against the wind. The lake was black behind them. Brendan turned when he heard the door and said something I couldn't hear over the wind. I was already moving. When I reached Claire, she was shaking. Her lips had gone pale, and her fingers, no gloves, were already stiff when she reached for my hand. I have never felt anything like that cold coming off my own child's skin, and I hope I never feel it again. I put my coat around her. I told Brendan to get out of my way. He didn't move immediately, and in the end it was Gerald, who had followed us outside, who said quietly, "Brendan, that's enough." Something in Gerald's voice had changed. I think even he understood that a line had been crossed that couldn't be walked back. I got Claire inside and to the car before anyone said anything else. I drove with the heat on maximum and Claire in the back seat wrapped in every blanket I could find. My phone had signal barely. 2 bars and I called 911 while I drove. I want to be clear about this because I've thought about it many times since. I called 911 the moment I had signal. When we'd been inside the house, my phone showed no service. That dead zone in the mountains is real, and if there are people reading this who think I should have called sooner, I understand. And I can only tell you that I tried. The paramedics met us 6 miles down the mountain. Claire's core temperature was low but not dangerous. Mild hypothermia. They said another 30 minutes, and the conversation would have been very different. I sat in the ambulance and held her hand while they worked, and she looked at me and said, "I didn't think they'd actually do it." She meant she'd known something was coming. She'd felt it building for months. The isolation from friends, the suggestion from Brendan, then from Patricia, then from Brendan again, that her anxiety was the source of every problem in the marriage. The way her access to the joint bank account had been quietly restructured so that large withdrawals required Brendan's approval. The lake house trip had been framed as reconciliation. She'd wanted to believe them. While Claire was being examined at the hospital in Asheville, I sat in a plastic chair in the waiting room and called my brother. Walt picked up on the second ring. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "Give me 72 hours. I said, "Do what you do best." He said, "I always do. I need to tell you a little about Walt, because he matters to this story in ways that the Whitmore family could not have anticipated." Walt is 58, lean, quiet-spoken, with the kind of patience that comes from spending decades waiting for people to make mistakes. He spent his career covering financial fraud, municipal corruption, and what he calls the small crimes of large families, the kind of wrongdoing that happens in plain sight inside wealthy, insular communities, because everyone involved has too much to lose to say anything. He knows how to file public records requests. He knows how to read a corporate filing. He knows which county clerk offices keep physical records going back 30 years. And he had known the Whitmore name for a long time before I called him that night. Gerald Whitmore, Walt said. When I said the name, has been on my peripheral radar for about 6 years. I asked him what that meant. He said, "It means I looked once and decided the story wasn't ripe yet. I think it might be ripe now." Over the next 3 weeks, while Claire stayed at my house in Knoxville and slowly started to eat full meals again, Walt worked. He drove to Asheville. He drove to the county courthouse. He talked to former employees of Whitmore Timber, LLC, 2 of whom had signed non-disclosure agreements years earlier, and were now, with the statute of limitations approaching expiration on certain matters, more willing to talk. He pulled property records and tax filings and the incorporation documents of 7 shell companies that Gerald Whitmore had created between 2009 and 2018. What Walt found was not subtle, once you knew where to look. It was only invisible because no one had looked. The shortest version is this. Gerald Whitmore had spent the better part of 15 years systematically defrauding a business partner named Roy Ellison. Roy had co-founded what became Whitmore Timber with Gerald back in 1987, when they were both young men with ambition and a shared love of the mountains. Over time, Gerald had used a series of contract modifications, small changes, buried in legal language, signed during periods when Roy was dealing with health problems to shift equity out of Roy's hands and into a network of entities that existed entirely on paper. By 2019, Roy Ellison owned almost nothing of a company he had helped build from nothing. He died in 2021, believing he had simply been unlucky in business. Roy's son, a 34-year-old electrician named Marcus Ellison, had been trying to tell people this story for 2 years. He had filed a complaint with the state attorney general's office. He had hired a lawyer who eventually stopped returning his calls. He had sent documents to 2 newspapers, neither of which had followed up. He had been, in every sense of the word, ignored. Walt called Marcus Ellison on a Tuesday evening. Marcus drove to Knoxville on Wednesday morning. I sat at my kitchen table with my brother and a young man who had lost his father, and watched him spread out 3 years of documentation that told exactly the same story Walt had reconstructed independently. The corroboration was, Walt told me later, the cleanest he'd seen in 30 years of this work. Walt filed the story a 12,000-word investigation, with an independent outlet that syndicates to regional papers across the Southeast. It published on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office had confirmed they were reviewing the materials. By the following Tuesday, the North Carolina Attorney General's office had opened a formal investigation. Gerald Whitmore's attorney released a statement calling the allegations categorically false and politically motivated. Patricia gave a brief interview to a local television station in which she described her family as being targeted by people who misunderstand the complexity of long-term business relationships. Brendan did not comment publicly. 3 months later, Gerald Whitmore was indicted on 4 counts of financial fraud and 2 counts of filing false corporate documents. The civil case brought by Marcus Ellison's attorney, newly reinvigorated by Walt's reporting, resulted in a settlement that restored a significant portion of what Roy Ellison had been owed. Marcus called me when he heard. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Claire filed for divorce the same week the indictment was announced. Brendan did not contest it. Their attorneys reached a settlement that returned the money that had been quietly redirected out of her accounts during the marriage, an amount that, once itemized, was larger than either of us had realized. She used part of it to take a leave from teaching. She spent 2 weeks with me in Knoxville, and then she drove to the coast, and she sent me pictures of herself on the beach with her shoes off and her face turned toward the sun. The assault charge, and yes, what happened at that lake house met the legal definition, because my daughter had said no and been physically moved toward an open door in 26-degree weather, was handled separately. It was a misdemeanor charge ultimately, and the legal system being what it is, Brendan Whitmore received a fine and a year of probation. That part I am less at peace with. I think about Roy Ellison's son who fought for 3 years and nearly couldn't get anyone to listen. I think about the NDA signers who were afraid for years. I think about all the quiet harms that require a very specific kind of luck, a brother who knows the right questions, a young man who refused to give up, a father who went through a door to ever see daylight. But I also think about Claire on that beach. I think about Sunday mornings, which are ours again. She calls without fail, every week. And she chatters about her garden and her students and her weekend plans. And I sit in my kitchen with my coffee, and I listen to every single word. The Whitmores thought they knew every variable in that lake house. They didn't know that the quiet, unremarkable retired school teacher standing in their hallway had a brother who spent his whole career waiting for exactly a family like theirs. They should have paid more attention.